Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We're your hosts, Adriana M.A. and
Jackie Sanders. We're two art professionals sharing forth the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
We talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday.
So for today's episode, what we want to talk about is that dilemma that many working artists face on whether or not they should create work specifically for a particular exhibition or whether they should just let their creativity flow and then find a suitable venue afterwards. So on this episode too, just giving you a heads up, we're going to be using exhibitions as the main example, which are not necessarily a selling venue. For the record, but what we're discussing also applies to other types of events and selling venues like art fairs, networking events, museum and home shows, even releasing artwork and collections online through your newsletter or social media. And a quick disclaimer before we dive in too is if you're just starting out and have not sold work yet, please save this episode for later. We strongly believe that when you're first trying to define your artistic style, money should stay out of that equation. Or there's a big risk that you end up doing artwork that's too derivative of artwork that may appear as sellable if it isn't. It's a big temptation. So that's where it's, you'll hear us both, harp on about this. Like you got to find your thing first and your most authentic voice. Then you go from there. But once you've started going, that's what we want to focus on today.
Yeah. And I think as artists, it's so important to have that time, especially in the beginning of your career, to really figure out your style, your vision, and what work you really feel drawn to make. But as opportunities come up, as you seek out opportunities as an artist, whether it's a group exhibition, whether it's a solo display in a coffee shop, whether it's a solo show, it does become this kind of ever evolving, ever undulating, okay, I'm making work because I have a deadline for an exhibition, or I'm in a period where I don't really have anything in the pipeline, so I can just make work. And I've worked in both ways. I know both of us have, where making work just to make almost feels like experimenting in a way. You're allowed to be playful. You're allowed to have the quote unquote risk of a piece, quote unquote, not working out, which honestly, I think a lot of artists can feel that sometimes when they make the best work because you don't have to play it safe because, okay, I have 16 pieces. I committed to this gallery and I only have 14. So now I have to make 2 more. But having those exhibitions can be super helpful too, though, because you have a forced deadline. You're forced to make decisions rather than being like super passive and exploring all of the possibilities. You're forced to kind of move your process forward and have a focused, cohesive series which is also just super empowering and helpful and productive in your art making practice. But throughout, as I said, my journey, I've loved working in both ways, both from having a coffee shop display where you have a handful of pieces and you hang it and it's great versus, okay, you commit to an exhibition 6 months in advance, a year in advance, and okay, I need X number for that display, and then reverse engineering those. Both are very different. But they're both super rewarding parts of your process, especially knowing that the work that you're making in your studio will then become on display in this specific space. That's a super empowering idea too, of knowing that people will be seeing your work rather than getting lost in the day-to-day of your studio. Like, what's the point? What am I doing here? It gives a purpose and a drive other than the joy of making work itself.
Yeah, which like if someone's making art as a hobby, which is perfectly fine, perfectly valid, and absolutely amazing, then, I think for some people where the question comes in of like to sell or not to sell is when they're piling up and, someone in your household is going, where are you going to put all that? And you've already given, so much artwork away at that point, right? Then maybe that question comes up. But for folks that are thinking about this, from a more business side of things, which is of course what we try to focus on the podcast, then it just becomes a question of like logistics, or at least I think of it in logistics a lot of ways. So if I'm going to have a solo exhibition, right? Am I going to create new work that can still fit in with perhaps existing pieces, and still be cohesive with the rest of it, right? And try to put it all together. Or am I going to try to make everything from scratch? And what does that timeline look like? How many pieces would I have to do per week to reach that deadline? And I think if you are going to work with a venue, to create, especially if you're going to be creating work for them, or specifically for that exhibition, I think it's going to be extremely, extremely important that right off the gate, you communicate clearly to them expectations. So it's one thing to say, oh yeah, I can make 20, 30 pieces, for that time. It's only 6 months away. It's only a year away. It's 2 years away, whatever it is. But then knowing, life does get in the way. You don't just work for that exhibition necessarily. You probably have other things to do and family and other responsibilities. So it's like, how can you keep it manageable? And again, can you mix some of what you already have with something new and they still speak to each other and they're still cohesive and then meet your requirements that way? Because you also don't want to burn any bridges by like, oh yeah, I'm going to have 30 pieces for you and you only have four. Like, whoops.
Mhm. And sometimes when you're in that art making flow, like, of course, you may feel compelled and drawn towards, oh, I want to do this new series about this subject matter using these colors. And I think we've all been there where we kind of get that high of the beginning of the creative process. And you're like, you have the vision in place.
Yeah.
But then, okay, 3 pieces into the series, you're like, actually, I'm not really feeling like connected to this series anymore, but I just committed to make 20 of them for the show. Not saying that logistically that can't be like communicated, or maybe the opportunity has to go on to another artist who already has a series, but that's a tough place to be in and a lot of pressure to put on yourself too as an artist to say, oh, I'm starting completely from scratch. So I love that idea that you have, Adriana, where of course sometimes you want to have like your newest pieces on display. You want to be excited about what all these people are going to see. But whether you can do like half old pieces, half new pieces, or especially having those cousins of each other from an artwork evolution standpoint. They don't have to be twins. They don't even have to be siblings, but some type of family tree hierarchy of how, okay, this piece evolved into your newest 5, but the other 15 were the evolution to get you there. That makes sense narratively.
Exactly. And, and that's why I said it's so important to have that communication up front because, depending who you're working with and what relationship we have with them, you might get someone that's like, your show is on X date, do whatever. Like, we're going to love it anyways, like, go, be yourself. And then you're going to have others that are like, okay, we need to plan in advance because we're going to have artist talks. We're going to have other activities with collectors and things like that. We're going to have promotional materials that go around it. So we need to know 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 2 months in advance what this thing's going to be about. What's the flagship flagship piece, that we're going to be using on promotional materials. That is what we're going to use to promote whatever else is in that show. So it's like, there's a lot of that. So communication will be really important to do. And then going back to that idea of like, okay, so you're like, okay, I have the venue. This is amazing. I'm just going to dive in. Something that could happen. And this is something that did happen to me, when I was starting out is you may find, depending what kind of venues, you're going through, like, I was doing art markets and fairs and things like that. You're going to find some themes and styles maybe have a wider appeal and start selling really well. And it can be very tempting at that point to say like, well, if this flower in this color sells well and I need to pay my bills, could I perhaps just make more of the thing and see what happens, right? But just because it sells at some venues or in a specific event by a specific organizer, there's no guarantee that it's going to work in other places. So it's that idea of like, yes, you have to pay bills, but then if it compromises the authenticity of your artistic expression, is it worth it at that point? Now, I will make a quick parenthesis there, big asterisk, right? To basically say like, if you're going the commercial artist route, that is perfectly valid way to do it, right? You find your niche, you do your thing, you rinse and repeat. I mean, there's artists that you look at their artwork from 10 years ago or last week, you can tell it's the same person and it looks the same. And no shame to that game. Like, look, you pay your bills like you have to. But as it relates to us talking about exhibitions you have coming up, obviously you're not going to have a gallery ask you to do the same level, same style, same everything of work every year, because then everybody's going to be like, it's the same stuff, right? So we're thinking about like artists that are like, I'm still evolving my style, I'm still working on that, but I also have to pay bills. So that's kind of where we're going with this. It's like, how do you balance those two things?
Right. And I mean, the finances are one portion of it, of wanting to make work to sell it or to be for a specific venue. But kind of going back to the process of making the work itself for a specific exhibition versus making just the sake of making, there are so many pros and cons to each thing. So thinking about making artwork for an exhibition specifically, a few things we've already kind of covered, but worth reiterating. some of the advantages are like you have a clear and focused direction on a timeline, on an end date, so that you can really reverse engineer. Okay, by August, I need 15 pieces. Currently, I have 7 that can work in that series. Now, here's my timeline for cranking out the rest of them. It's not compromising the creative process, but having that structure of we're bound by the limits of time in this physical world. And so you can't just say, oh, well, they'll get done when they get done and hope for the best, because you need to make sure that they get done on time, or else you're going to have a very unhappy curator or gallery owner. It also allows you to really tailor that artistic expression and that time that you're focusing in your studio to a specific theme or a specific concept, and the understanding of, okay, this exhibition is going to be about X, or all of the work in this series is going to explore this visual element. They're all going to have these shades of color in it. And so having that specific series, knowing that they're going to be on display together, can be super, super empowering, rather than getting distracted by the shiny object syndrome that often comes up in the fun elements of the creative process. And it, for that reason, then makes you, out of necessity and visual consistency, create a cohesive body of work that ideally, again, existing artwork could be incorporated into, but it also is that set series that you could continue to move on with after the exhibition, keep iterating on, or kind of have it as that packaged up little bow of here's a series that's this independent thing. Now, through this process, I realize I actually do want to go and do something different, but having it all together in one cohesive series can be super empowering. And having an exhibition on the books is really what forces you to get that done.
Yeah, and I love those ideas because sometimes it can feel in the studio like you're just, I don't know, like you said earlier, you're experimenting, you're playing. Sometimes there's this feeling of drift of like, I don't know where I'm going with this. So having something to kind of anchor you down a little bit, could be good and bad. But a few of the other benefits is if you're making work specifically, towards an exhibition, is you can make sure that the artwork that you're creating can engage with a specific audience that aligns with the exhibition context. So you get to set the theme, you get to think about who the audience is, especially while you're making the work, and how they would respond to it or how you want them to feel, right? And interact with it. And in doing so, you can also ensure that the artwork speaks directly to the overarching theme of what you're trying to get across, right? Which could be like not just, let's say, the venue that you're going with. Like, yes, you have your exhibition, and say there's other exhibitions happening in the same space at the same time, not necessarily, in the same room. It could be the room next door. But let's say that curator is asking you to have an overarching theme. I don't know, the 3 artists exhibiting this month were focusing on nature. I don't know, something.
Yeah. It's at a nature center somewhere. And
yeah, exactly. Then you can make sure it's not just your specific thing you put together, but you can also help align it with everything else that your venue is trying to do for that specific time period. So those are some of the things to kind of think about. On the flip side of it, of course, there are some challenges involved, when this deadline's coming. So you may feel a little bit of a constraint by the specific requirements or expectations of the exhibition. Once again, be clear up front. If this is something you apply to, like an open call, make sure to ask questions of anything that's not in that open call, because you might not realize part of the constraints might be size, or the way that it hangs, or the way that it's displayed, or where the lighting is, or things like that. So definitely keep that in mind, right? And make sure to ask questions. But yeah, you may feel a little bit of that constraint, especially like life, like we said, gets in the way. And then you're like, no, it's in 2 weeks. What do you mean it's in 2 weeks? I only have 5 pieces out of the 17. What? So yeah, that can happen. But that's where, having effective time management really is going to be of essence. And if that's not a strong skill, perhaps get assistance if you can. But you got to think about this. Besides the time to make the artwork itself, you also need to budget time for framing if you have to. Photos, what's going to be used for promo, for their end, your end. The varnishing, adding hanging hardware, especially if they have specifics of what they do and do not allow. Updating your inventory, adding to your website, sending out newsletter. You kind of get the gist of it. It's not just, ta-da, I made this thing, and someone will magically take it off your studio and hang it in an exhibition. I mean, maybe if you have if you're Jeff Koons and have a team of, people that help you out, that's a different story.
Yeah. And that's definitely one of those things where you want to, I always try to incorporate that added buffer into the last, even like month, which might sound aggressive, but like set the deadline closer than what it actually is, because inevitably there's going to be one painting that you want to make a better version of. There's going to be photos and all those things that you listed that adds up in time. And there's no worse feeling than finishing a painting when you have to deliver it to the gallery the next day. And again, we've all been there of like, I just want to finish this one and include it. But then you might not have good pictures of it for your website. You can't make that the shining star in your newsletter because you literally took it to the gallery the second it was dry. And that does put that pressure to create within a defined theme or concept. So sometimes people find a lot of focus and relief in, okay, I'm just going to focus on this one thing and maybe jot down the ideas of, oh, it'd be awesome to explore this. I have this kind of shiny object syndrome idea of what I'd want to do one day, but I can't focus on that right now. I'm just focusing on this one theme. But that can also feel really limiting. And that's also, again, depending on how you as an artist relate to your creative process, what makes you thrive. And oftentimes it's kind of the balance between the two, but it's worth noting how you work and how you work best. And finding that balance between fulfilling the exhibition's requirements, but still keeping that artistic integrity and authenticity in your creative process. So up next, we just talked about the process of creating artwork for an exhibition. And up next, we're going to talk about creating artwork first and then finding an exhibition venue afterwards. But first, let's go ahead and hear from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by the Level Up Artists business community. This ever-evolving membership values community over competition and growing connections with fellow creatives who share the same goals and challenges as you.
Life as a modern artist can be both exciting and overwhelming. Art school or self-taught, emerging or seasoned professional, there's a lot of information out there, but what do working artists actually need?
Other industries have continuing education programs for their professionals to sharpen up their skills and stay up to date with the systems, technology, and tools needed to succeed. And we believe that artists should too.
We've spent countless hours of trial and error weeding through tons of information to find the gold and creating sustainable systems that actually work so you don't have to waste your time going down endless rabbit holes.
We are passionate about exchanging ideas and sharing resources with fellow career-minded artists about the business side of art. From artist documents and exhibition prep to templates and tools to help you work faster and smarter, our course modules cover everything from social media to technology and sustainable studio practices too.
Ready to get started? Head on over to levelupartisthub.com to learn more, get immediate access, and level up your creative career today.
All right, so welcome back. Before the break, we talked about creating artwork for an exhibition, the challenges, the benefits, and now we want to talk about making artwork first and then finding an exhibition venue to put your beautiful work in. So, of course, making the artwork first allows us as artists to really be very genuine and authentic in our art making practice without that pressure of the timeline, which can be very liberating. You can really explore, experiment, take risks, discover new directions, new voices that you want to explore in your work without that restraint of time or a deadline. And as artists, I think we've all kind of been there where we can uncover those unexpected connections in our art making process, maybe relationships between different mediums that we haven't explored yet, a visual theme that you're like, oh, well, I just made these 4 paintings and in 3 of them, this motif keeps popping up. Let me explore that some more to where you have the time and the space and the creative energy to then freely explore whatever things, patterns, experiments you find drawn towards because you're on your own timeline, which is very liberating.
Yes, it is. And I love how it can allow you to have a diverse body of work that can transcend and evolve from a single theme or concept. So you may have started with, I don't know, I'm going to make this up for a second, right? Like I feel really passionate about marine animals. I don't know. I'm going to go with that, right? I'm going to feel passionate about marine animals and you're painting marine animals. And then suddenly it strikes the inspiration that now you want to create a new series or maybe an offshoot of it where it focuses more on awareness for the trash that ends up in the oceans that affects said marine animals that you're so passionate about, right? So like it gives you a still related or somewhat related vein of work out of that original one. But once again, like if that exhibition we were talking about, earlier, or supposed an exhibition example, you had said your theme was marine animals and you left it at that, then you might feel that little bit of like, wait a minute, can I also add this other thing about ocean trash too? Like there's some of that. But the good thing is if you don't have a preset thing going on, and or maybe the exhibition venue does not put that restraint on you, then you do whatever. So it's really cool. And then, of course, the plus side of that is you don't have that time constraint, and you have more time to finish the artwork. So if you do want to go back in there and make this awesome octopus, and now you want to add it like it's holding a little piece of trash as part of your new series, then you can do that. You can go back and modify some of that existing work to communicate some of what you want to, talk about in your work currently and that you're excited to talk about. On the flip side of that, of course, let's say you did go with marine trash situation, then now you have to find a venue that not only complements that artwork, but aligns with your aesthetic and conceptual goals. Maybe the gallery that you were hoping to go after with this, they're like, that's a little too socially aware, and we'd rather have something more decorative, which nothing wrong with that. It depends what kind of audience buys from them. So now it's like, they just wanted the octopus, not octopus plus trash conversation. So now you got to figure out where's that going to go. Also, there is a chance that you may need to compromise on the original venue vision, if the venue doesn't match your expectations. So maybe once you get talking to them, some of the things that they're looking for, you wanted to make that octopus painting we just talked about to be like 6 feet wide, and they're like, no, biggest you can do is 3 feet. And now it's like, okay, now I got to step back and figure out, what am I going to do? Can I still do it or not? Or where am I going to find, a gallery that wants that 6-foot octopus holding trash in a tentacle? I don't know.
Yeah. And to that point, I think that is one of the biggest things, especially if you're exploring things that have scale considerations, lighting considerations that are very specific for those pieces. It's definitely not a reason not to make that artwork, right? But it's very different than making artwork for a space that you know beforehand. For example, like that example specifically, if you know, okay, there's room for a 6-foot sculpture in there, go on with yourself, do that 6-foot sculpture, maybe 2-3-foot sculptures. And it's a different process because there is a future home for it, right? Rather than having to take those considerations into account when you are applying for exhibitions of the physical space, the lighting, the atmosphere. Will that enhance the viewer's connection with your artwork? And that can sometimes limit exhibition opportunities for you, which is not always a bad thing. Oftentimes it's then often just getting in front of the right audience for you. But especially as an emerging artist, as a newer artist, that can feel very disheartening to be like, oh, well, my work doesn't match this space. With the asterisk caveat of not every exhibition space is for everyone. If you do abstract art, it doesn't necessarily make sense for you to be in a gallery that does all portrait style and landscape paintings, right? And thinking of it in that way, but will affect how you spend your time as an artist too, because you will have to put more time and effort into networking, into researching exhibition spaces, galleries, and really establishing those connections in your immediate and extended community of where your work fits best, where your audience is, and therefore building those connections with them so that okay, I'm making this work. Let's see where it will go.
Yeah, and it's that idea of like, let's say you did make, that 6-foot sculpture, like you said. Now you got to find who can fit it, who has a door big enough to get that thing through there. Can you imagine you make this giant thing? Are they on a second floor and your sculpture's like 500 pounds and not, that floor's not rated to hold that weight? Like there's so many other things, but it's kind of like what we were talking about. Like you can go freely with it, but if you're going to find the venue afterwards, then maybe you had this grand vision of, I have this series of work. There's so many paintings, so many sculptures, and they might say, we can fit most of it, but that sculpture is a no-go. And if that was what you wanted as a flagship, then okay, time to rethink. Are you going to make a smaller one? Do you have time? Like, anyways, those are some considerations for sure.
Yeah. And that's definitely one of the biggest things with if you are focusing on the work first and then finding opportunities, marketing yourself, marketing the work, you as a business is huge for that. Because you kind of have to put out into the world, hey, this is who I am. This is what I'm about. This is the work I make. And then lean on your network, lean on your marketing, on social media, on your website. having a newsletter, going to networking events where gallery owners are, where fellow artists are. Maybe there's a group that meets up in your community that does a similar style to you, that knows already of exhibition spaces that cater to your work very well. But a lot of what you will need to focus on is that marketing aspect of it, because that's really how your work that you're creating on your own gets tied with the perfect pair of the right gallery and the right space for it to be displayed in.
Yeah, I love like some artists, some of their advice they give is you basically have to scream it from the rooftops in a way, like, hey, I have this stuff. You have to create the awareness. You have to generate that interest and say, I'm looking for a space that I can display it in, not just, I make this thing and that's the end of it. There's a little more call to action that needs to be involved there. And one of the ways to do so is by sharing your creative journey, your unique perspective, documenting parts of the process with photos and videos that then you can share online. And making sure that as part of your marketing efforts, knowing that that is essential, regardless of whether or not the artwork was created specifically for an exhibition or vice versa, you got to do it. You got to do the marketing. You got to, you got to ask around. You got to do the networking, like Jackie said too. Like, you have to do it. Like, if you want it to end up in front of the right audience, you have to share it, especially, of course, as we're talking about in this episode. You want to sell it, you got to tell people it exists. If it's just in your basement or in your backyard under a tarp, nobody's going to know. But as we wrap this up, some of the few key points that we want to reiterate with you guys is that, artists should consider your creative process and your goals when deciding whether you want to create the artwork before you have the exhibition lined up or afterwards, right? How are you going to work towards that? What kind of timelines are involved? Obviously, like we covered, both approaches have advantages and they also have some challenges. And you need to find that balance between the artistic exploration and meeting exhibition requirements, or you could think of it as self-imposed timelines as well, but essentially like giving yourself that goalpost to work towards. Are you going to stay all cohesive until you get to that goalpost that you made yourself, or you're just going to explore around and, try to make yourself a plan? How do you keep yourself from just drifting and, going all over the place? Like, you got to anchor down every once in a while.
Exactly. And with either strategy, the effectiveness of your marketing is really key. Whether you're constantly promoting your work, how it's evolving in your experimental play creative practice, and then networking with galleries to get a connection there. Or if you have an exhibition coming up, doing promotion for that, kind of having that excitement around this body of work that you've already made, then being on display in this space. Regardless of which approach you take, marketing is always key, of just screaming it from the rooftops and get people excited about the work that you're making. Because ultimately, the goal is really just to showcase your artist's unique point of view, right? Showcasing your creative journey and engaging the viewers of your journey of this specific exhibition, of a specific piece that you're making, in that meaningful dialogue of who you are, what you're making, why you're making it, and creating those transformational experiences for the viewer.
And if you can get paid while doing that, hey, let's thrive, not starve. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's conversation. And thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this one.
As always, our blog will be linked in today's show notes, where you can find episode notes and links to all of our other podcast episodes.
And if you want to stay connected with us in between episodes, share your feedback, or have a question you would like for us to answer on the podcast, you can reach us through social media. I'm at May Art across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. And if you want to follow the podcast, we are at Level Up Artists on Instagram.
You can also visit us at Level Up Artist Hub to join our business community, get immediate access to templates, resources, and course modules to level up your creative career today.
Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.